Well, the first thing to say is that for Americans, we tend to think of the world globally. We don't think, okay, now we're not going to think about Europe because we're going to think about Asia. It's more we're constantly thinking Asia, Middle East, Europe, Latin America, Africa, because the United States is interested in building a world that is at peace and that is open to commerce, including our own commerce. And yet, as we look at the world for the 21st century, we can see that the biggest difference, put it another way, that the part of the world where there's the biggest difference between the best possible case and the worst possible case is probably Asia. If in the 21st century we see Asia, in a sense, becoming more like Europe, more peaceful, more prosperous, more democratic, it's likely that the whole world is going to be relatively peaceful in the 21st century, and it'll be a good century for all of us. On the other hand, if the rivalries that we say now between China and Japan and some of the other rivalries in the region sort of get worse and Asia becomes a continent torn by war, serious instability, then given what modern war is like, the whole world is going to suffer enormously. So that's the logic that leads Americans to think, okay, we need to do what we can to help nudge Asia toward the more positive future. But that doesn't mean we're not going to be thinking about Europe or the Middle East or other parts of the world, because they are important. They remain important. And during the Cold War, when America was mostly focused on Europe, we fought two very long wars in Asia, the Korean and Vietnam War. So America is not a power that can only think of one place at a time. We actually do have a kind of a global perspective. I think it would be a mistake to read too much into the lack of support for the president's Syria policy. He called for military strikes against Syria, and it was clear that in Congress there wasn't a lot of support, and in the public there wasn't. But I think that had more to do with the way the question was asked and the alternatives that were presented. In general, polls have always shown that Americans are less supportive of using troops for humanitarian purposes than they are of using troops for a strategic purpose. So if a U.S. ally were to be invaded, I think that you would get a very different kind of political response from the American people. But the proposed military action in Syria, it was never all that clear from the administration how big was it going to be. Was the purpose to change the outcome of the Syrian civil war, not to change the purpose? Who were the good guys in Syria? Who were the bad guys in Syria? All of this was framed in a way that I think made people wonder, just what are we doing here? So I think the American people are more skeptical. I mean, after Iraq, after Afghanistan, American people are more skeptical about the use of force in international affairs. But I think there's still a sense that if there's a clear threat or a sense of a clear attack on one of our allies, or a situation that is sort of where real active American foreign policy is necessary, then I think you'll still see the same kind of rallying around we've seen in the past. Well, I think clearly it is raising some questions both at home in the United States and among some of our partners. And again, I think it's important to put this in perspective, that the technology of communications has changed rapidly in the last 20 years. International law, national law, and agreements haven't really kept pace with these changes. We've also seen, since 9/11, a tremendous sense of security risk in the U.S., but also in many other countries. So what governments did is what governments naturally do. They used the technological capacities that were being developed, and I say governments because the U.S. government is certainly not the only one that's been involved with these things. So used the technological capacities it was developing in order to maintain security. Now, at one level, That's okay with me in the sense our fundamental human right is the right not to be killed. And it's very important that governments, I think all citizens of all states think it's very important that governments do what they can to protect our physical security, our lives. But at the same time, that may be the primary human right, but it's not the only human right. None of us want to see governments under the excuse of protecting our physical security taking away or seriously constraining all of the other human rights that are important to us. In the United States and again in Europe, we have a tradition of trying to adjudicate these difficult questions. How much liberty do we let the government infringe in order to provide protection? Through the political process where our elected representatives consider all the options and make laws. Again, I think the technology has moved so fast and the security threats were so high that we lost that balance a bit. And that what you're seeing in the United States and what you're seeing in other countries is legislatures are now taking on the question, what balance should the government strike and what oversight does there need to be to prevent the government from going too far? And I think in the U.S. we are already revisiting some of the issues that led to the Snowden disclosures. And I think in other countries also, parliaments are looking at this. Then there's also the question of international issues, because Germany might have one set of laws, France another, the United States another, India yet another set. How will does that mean that Americans must be bound by German law in monitoring calls? Does it mean that Germans have to observe American or Indian restraints or Chinese? How do the international cyberspace by definition is international. So how do we resolve conflicts between political and legal norms in one state with others? That clearly has to be a matter of negotiation between different governments. And in some cases, the agreements should be relatively easy to reach, in others more difficult. I think we are now going to see a very serious discussion among a number of countries. How do we regulate cyberspace, and how do we regulate government activity in cyberspace? But again, the technology is going to continue to change, probably faster than governments can reach agreements about old technology. There will be new technology. So this is just going to be an ongoing challenge, I think.